Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing awesome conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: the Pew Research Center asked 13,000 Americans about their attitudes toward advances in AI. This week, they published findings from the most recent surveys conducted in December of 2022. And it turns out respondents are less impressed by AI that can generate text and images, and more impressed with uses of AI in the hard sciences. For example, 56% said robots that can perform surgery is a major advance, while only 16% say writing news articles is a major advance. 59% said using AI for drug discovery is a major advance, compared to only 31% who said generating images is a major advance. And 55% said generating images is either a minor advance or not an advance at all. Attitudes toward AI are evolving fast, but it's clear we've come to expect it to be ubiquitous in our lives. We'll continue discussing the social implications of AI in the weeks and months ahead. And as always, we will link to that full article in today's show notes. But now shifting to this week's conversation, Ken Wenger is the author of the forthcoming book, Is the Algorithm Plotting Against Us? A Layperson's Guide to the Concepts, Math, and Pitfalls of AI. I've been reading it voraciously over the past week, getting ready for this conversation with Ken, and it is excellent. Ken's a great writer, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. He's a deep thinker, and he's also the Senior Director of Research and Innovation at CoreAVI, as well as the Chief Technology Officer at Squint AI. Ken's work focuses on the intersection of artificial intelligence and determinism, enabling neural networks to execute in safety-critical systems. Ken has co-authored 2 articles in the scholarly journal Machine Learning with Applications and several white papers for different publications, including Embedded Computing Design. He also holds several patents under the auspices of CoreAVI. And without further ado, Ken Wenger, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a little bit more about your background and, of course, how you got into this space.
Sure. Hi, thank you very much. First, I want to say thank you for having me here. That was a great, too great of an introduction. Thank you. So my background, I started as an engineer in the GPU driver development space. So for a large part of my career, going back 15 years, I spent a lot of that time working with GPUs and trying to understand how to get complexity to execute in a deterministic way in GPUs. And a lot of that went into developing GPU drivers. And it's kind of interesting because when the whole AI world started to pick up again in around 2012, I was right in the midst of GPU development. And as you know, AI and the advances of AI today are in large part thanks to advances in GPUs. So yeah, I feel like it kind of all came together at the right time for me.
So I mentioned I've really been enjoying the book. I'd be curious, what interview or what bit of insight surprised you most when you were doing the research for the book?
Well, a few things surprised me. I think from the research perspective for the book, one of the things that surprised me the most is how far back artificial intelligence and research into this space goes, and how much what we have today is influenced and inspired by what we've learned from ourselves and from how intelligence and to some extent how our minds work in humans. And one of the things that I've been most surprised about in general in AI research, not so much for the book, but AI in general is the idea of emerging concepts. So, for example, in neural networks, there are many properties of neural networks and the way they function that were not programmed in by us, and we didn't design them that way. It just kind of emerged out of the complexity of the system. And those properties tend to be very similar in some respect to how humans think or how animals think. So, for example, if you look at how the vision system in a mammal works, and how all the way from the retina to the brain, there's different layers of networks, and close to the retina we have, for example, edges of objects beginning to appear, and as we move deeper into the brain, complexity builds, and then you get textures and colors and things like whole structures like a face become to be important in those areas deeper in the brain. It turns out that with these artificial neural networks, the same thing happens, the same distribution of features happens there. But we didn't program it that way. It kind of emerged from that complexity. To me, that was one of the most surprising and rewarding things that I learned.
So I think one of the things that makes consumers suspicious of AI is because it's hard to understand how the decisions are being made. And as humans, when we interact with each other, usually there's some rubric or framework or logic that makes a decision explainable. But as you discuss a lot in the book, one of the fundamental attributes of a deep neural net is that, like you just said, it's often just hard to understand what inputs went into the output that the algorithm generates, or the automated decision. As an expert in the space of AI, and as the author of a book that tries to make sense of AI, how would you help consumers reconcile this conflicted set of feelings that they have about relying on automated decisions?
Well, I think the first part is to understand how these systems work a little bit. So this is part of the reason why I wrote the book. Is I think the public in general, at this point, especially in our timeline, they need some level of literacy, AI literacy, because of just the nature of how the world is evolving. And I think part of making, understanding that is knowing how these systems work to some extent. For example, when we say that they are black boxes and we don't understand how they work internally, to some extent, what we mean is you can think of them as these giant machines with many knobs, okay? And we understand how the knobs are adjusted, okay? So it's not that we don't understand anything about how they work and they've completely gone out of our hands. We really understand how we adjust the knobs. The problem is because there are so many knobs in the systems. Again, so imagine a machine, many knobs you adjust to get to map an input to a certain output. What happens is the patterns that it recognizes, it's very difficult for us to understand what are the patterns that became important in a prediction, right? So you have an input, it gets to an output. Some patterns in the process of going from the input to the output through all of these knobs, okay, resulting in patterns being correlated between the input and the output. Okay, and it's very difficult for us to now go back and understand what exactly were those patterns. So that's the extent of what we mean that we don't understand how they work, but they are still mathematical functions. They're not operating in some mystical form, and there's no, when we say they're artificial intelligence systems, we have to be very careful about what we mean by intelligence and not give it too much power. Does that kind of answer your question, or?
Yeah, but let me build on that. So knowing what you know as a scientist and a researcher and engineer, what are the kinds of decisions that you'd be skeptical, let's say, making on behalf of your kids? Let's say, what level of reading comprehension they have, or should they get an interview for a job or get into a school, or should a family member get approval for a loan? Where would you say you'd be skeptical, and where would you say you feel like it's a good thing for society that these decisions can be made using AI?
Yeah, so probably all of those examples that you just gave, I would be very skeptical. And the reason for that is because So, I mean, one of the issues that it gets talked about a lot with respect to AI is bias in the data, right? So we understand that data is biased, and therefore the models just reproduce that bias, right? The models are not, they're not special in that they're able, by some magic, identify bias and remove it. If there's bias in the data, they are affected by it. But that's just a very vanilla problem. I mean, we all know that. The biggest issue, I think, or one of the biggest issues with deploying these systems, as you say, in loan approval use cases, is that if you think about it, okay, right now, if you go to a bank and you want to apply for a loan, they're still going to run you through some model. Even if it isn't an AI model, they have some equation that they figure out based on some attributes how you qualify. But what you would think is there has to be some statistician. There has to be somebody who understands data and has an impetus to remove bias and have data as balanced as possible. I mean, that's the goal. And then there are always things like audits that you can perform on these models to understand, how are they dealing with certain parts of the population to make sure they're not, they're not affected by the bias in the data, right? The problem with AI is the scale and the access to it, right? So now anybody can just learn a few lines of code and write an algorithm, a neural network that's able to interpret data and deploy these as applications that then end up making decisions on your lives. But that person is not necessarily a data scientist, right? The person who designed these models now is able to access data and transform it and try to interpret it by the aid of these models without really understanding data or having any training in that space. Whereas before, you at least just by circumstance, you had to have been somebody who was trained in at least statistics. That's my biggest concern, is the access to it. Anybody could do it. And then the scale, right? You can deploy these systems at scale. It's making decisions about everybody's lives, affecting, and then it'll be too late before we realize really the impact on our lives that these things are having.
So you published your book just before ChatGPT was announced, and all of the euphoria, the hype, the confusion around what I'll call the snake pit of ethical issues related to generative AI. Talk me through the chapter that you're going to write for the next version of the book about generative AI. Where do you come out on it so far?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of interesting because from an achievement perspective, just ChatGPT, if you had talked to me a year ago, I wouldn't have predicted that we would be here today. I think it took me by surprise, the ability for it to at least seemingly behave as if it's understanding the conversation and produce very coherent text with, it seems, a lot of contextual memory. So you can carry a conversation for a certain amount of time, and it's remarkable how coherent it is. It isn't always right, as it's been well documented, right? But it is coherent to the point that it can confuse you. So that was very surprising to me. I didn't think we would be here this soon. So I would definitely talk about that in the next chapter of the book. I think one of the things that I find very interesting with ChatGPT and Bing Chat and how all of these language models are developing in the real world is that I think it's a bit of a case study between a misunderstanding from engineering and science and product management and marketing at some of these companies. Because I think what happens is I'm almost certain that in the engineering departments and in the research departments, they understand the limitations of the models, right? So they know these things are not ready for mass consumption. But sometimes I feel like companies just run a little bit too quickly with deploying these models. And I think it's a bit irresponsible because first, we don't know. So when things like Bing Chat come out and there are mistakes, inevitably there will be mistakes. Then what happens is the trust by the public dips. And then there is this sort of reverse hype where people say, well, see, the researchers in AI, it's not going anywhere. No one knows what's happening. Whereas that was there all along. We should have just been honest. We're just trying this thing new. There will be problems, but it is a remarkable engineering feat to see how quickly. I mean, 5 years ago, we couldn't we couldn't have a chatbot that was worth anything. And what these things are accomplishing today are just remarkable, but they're not there yet to be deployed. I think the public's education is not there yet. For example, I know people who are treating these things almost as a friend, which I think in some cases it's problematic. Asking questions about what choices they should make. You know, it almost is as if these models become therapists to some extent. And I think we need to figure out, not just from a technological standpoint, but also from an ethical and psychological standpoint, what do we do with these things before deploying them? That's my thought on it.
There's so many topics to unpack in that answer. And let's just start with the last one that you mentioned, the potential psychological impact of some of the ways that these very human-like conversations can impact the humans interacting with these LLMs, large language models, in unintended ways. Who is responsible if a vendor, whether it's OpenAI or Microsoft or Amazon, Google, Apple, who knows, uses content that it scrapes from the open web to generate conversations that cause harm to a human? Who owns responsibility for that conversation and the impact on the psychology of the user?
I think from a legal perspective, I think that still has to be worked out. I don't know that anybody has the answer from a legal perspective, but from a general responsibility perspective, I think the companies certainly have some responsibility to bear. I think there needs to be, as I said, more literacy from the public as well to understand what these models are doing. In a way that, for example, we didn't have this when social media really changed the world. I think hopefully now we've learned something from social media and how it changed the world, and we can react a little bit better in the case of this new transformational revolution. I think one of the things that we can learn is that we have to understand that when you're dealing with the public en masse, you're going to change dynamics in society that in ways that you can't predict. And in some cases, it's not going to be a beneficial change. And if we are not able to have the foresight to know, how are these models, for example, if we let them run wild, how are they going to change societal dynamics 5 years from now? If we don't know how to do that, we can at least say, look, there is a potential for changes to happen. By the way, these are models that are not really listening to you. This is how they work, right? There's a lot more effort that needs to be put in place before we just roll them out and get people hooked in. And this is just, as you said, one at the tip of the iceberg. We have recommender systems where you have similar models that are pushing you to watch more content, to buy more things. Again, in a way of changing you a little bit to optimize their goal. And I think that these kinds of use cases are a little bit irresponsible. And I think we need to, the companies need to be more responsible, and we also need to be more literate in the AI domain to not make these mistakes.
So your explanation of how LLMs work and kind of some of the simple vector math and how they select the best next word is very elegant and I think very accessible. You mentioned that AI is really good at replicating our inherent bias as a society at scale. Given those two things, help us describe to the audience what your solution would be to mitigating the impact of bias training data on these conversations that replicate human bias via things like ChatGPT.
I think, so let me just adjust something a little bit. So when these language models, when we say that what they're doing is they're essentially just generating the next word, that is correct at some level. But it's also true that we don't really know. One of the things that happens with these models that we're learning is that as they become larger and as they're trained with more and more data, they're behaving in ways that we didn't expect. And by that, again, I don't mean that they're suddenly starting to wake up. I'm not talking, we're not getting into the level of consciousness discussion right now. I'm just saying the patterns they're able to recognize and the way they're able to abstract concepts and find links between concepts, it's not well understood yet. Okay, so what that means is that it's very difficult to know, given a certain prompt to these models, what is it going to do after, right? If you say, I'm feeling depressed today, what is it going to do? Is it going to link the whole concept of depression to try to move you towards resources that are going to help you get out of that? Or is it going to make you dig deeper because that's just how those conversations have gone on the internet, as an example, right? We don't know how these things work. When it comes to bias and what I would do, I think there's different things we can do, and some of them have already been, discussed in research. So, for example, one of the problems that we have, as I said, so the data is biased, right? So one of the ways we can deal with that is we can try to balance it as much as possible. So, for example, why is it biased? Is there some population sample that's not represented equally in that data set? Is it because one of the problems is, for example, when we're discussing these models and their performance, we're saying, look at their accuracy, how well they're performing. Accuracy is a word that gets thrown out all the time. But the problem with accuracy alone, and again, this is well known in the research circle, the problem with accuracy alone is that it doesn't capture the full picture. So, for example, you can have a model that's 90% accurate on some problem, meaning that 90% of the time it gives you the right answer in testing. However, that doesn't tell you how often it commits either false positives or false negative failures, right? And you can have the same accuracy on two different models where one has more false positives than the other. This is a very big, in some cases, this isn't a big problem. In other cases, it is. In the book, I have an example of a case where they were using models to figure out if people should be granted bail in a court system, right? You're an offender. The judge has to make a decision: should you be granted bail or not? And the decision basically depends on whether or not the judge believes that you're going to commit a crime if you're set free. When you replace a judge with these models, sometimes the studies say, well, look, my model is 10% more accurate than a judge on average. But there is no discussion on how often is it setting people free who end up committing crimes, or how often it's sending people to jail that otherwise it's impossible to know that they would have committed a crime. So these are problems that need to be discussed. We need to know the cost of deploying these models. We need to at least discuss it. And the cost sometimes is in other than just accuracy, right? In other areas than just accuracy. And I don't think we all know the answer. I mean, I can't tell you how to fix the problem. All I know is that if we don't know the answer yet, maybe we shouldn't deploy them, right? If we don't have a clear solution, and I don't think we have in many cases, especially the ones around ethical problems, we don't, then we shouldn't be deploying them there.
Part of the ethical challenges that arise from these early conversations around generative AI is the commercial pressures to, like you said, rush products to market before they're mature. And we obviously saw that with the very high profile hallucinations by Bing and Bard from Google, and including OpenAI. How do you, given that, if I'm speaking somewhat cynically, money and the economics of commercializing technology drive the introduction of these products. If you're having a conversation with, Sundar from Google or, any of the leaders and telling them, wait, it's in the best interest of society to wait until these are ready. How do you make that case given the pressure that they have to get these products to market before they're mature?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right that commercial pressure is a real thing. But I think, so one of the things you can do, for example, as I've already alluded to, you could deploy a beta program where you're honest about the capabilities of the model, what exactly it's doing, how it's working, what are the possible outcomes and mistakes that you could expect given the current state of the research, right? I think for some of these models, I think it's important to have some level of deployment, because otherwise you don't get the scale, right? So how do you know that they're not going to work at scale? You try it, and then if it fails, then you know you have some work to do. But then we have to be honest. We can't say, look, we're rolling out this magical new technological achievement that's going to change our lives, when we don't know really what are the shortfalls. You can say we're trying to figure out the shortfalls. These are the possible ones that we can think of, and then we'll keep you updated as these things, surface. The other thing that we can do, and this is part, by the way, of what we're doing at Squint, is there's a field of AI called explainable AI. Okay, and for some reason right now, it seems like explainable AI, in which this field looks at how to understand neural networks. So the whole idea of explainable AI is figuring out what are driving the predictions within these models. And there's a lot of research that's going on today in that space. And right now, it seems like there's two different roads. There is research on the perception language models, and basically just getting these models that perform some sort of task. And then there's research in understanding how these models work, but they haven't been brought together. And I think one of the things we have to do is we have to realize that they are part of the same thing. They're not two different fields, right? And so as we are developing and deploying these models, we should and can be deploying them together with some of these explainable AI ideas to try to sort of monitor them at runtime and give alerts to user and say, look, based on our analysis, these models are going a little bit off the rails right now. So this conversation doesn't seem to be going in the right direction. Adjust or be aware that these answers are not correct. Don't trust this particular prediction very much in the case of, let's say, a computer vision system. These are all things we can start doing. And some people are doing, and like I said, that's one of the things we are looking at Squint AI.
Generative AI at this point, we're literally months into the launch of ChatGPT. It's very experimental. What do you think if we fast forward out, let's say 3 years, medium-term horizon? What's one thing that will be commonplace that even today would seem like science fiction?
One of the things that I've learned is that predictions usually don't go well, because it's very difficult for us to understand, for some reason, how fast technology advances, even in areas where we are supposedly expert in, right? If you had asked people at Motorola around the time when the iPhone came about, they would have said 3 years hence, the best phone would have had slicker buttons, right? I think, if I were to guess, I think that models are going to get better. They're going to get better. We're going to get better at understanding what they're doing as well. But one of the things that, and by the way, the whole idea of the metaverse and this virtual reality moving in and being part of, when all of these things come together, the AI advancements, the advancements in AI, virtual reality, all these universes that we're building, I think it's going to be very interesting how life is blurred between your real world and the virtual world in which you exist. I think it's going to be a much more profound change that we have seen with, as I said, social media. In some cases, in some countries, your value in social media determines a lot what your value in life is. And people are moving more and more towards the social media world and putting more value in their image there than they do in their real life. How that's going to come together when all of these technologies move into that virtual environment, I think it's hard. I don't think that's going to happen in the next 3 years. I know you said next 3 years, but if you want to know, like, in my opinion, what I worry the most, or what do I think is going to be the biggest transformational thing that's going to happen, is when all these technologies combine. Okay, and then you're going to have things where, today, as we saw with Twitter, if you're shut out of Twitter, or there are companies that have a lot of power by just shouting you out from a particular platform, right? Because that's your value is that platform. If you're shut out of it, then you have no more value, let's say. Now imagine where your entire existence is in that virtual world. And then you may be shut out of that one. How would that work? How would that affect society? I think that is one of the things that I think we need to start discussing a lot more, and I don't see a lot of discussion in that area.
So believe it or not, we're about out of time, but I'm not letting you off the hot seat without answering one last question for me. So let's say you're coaching your kids about what skills to invest in today to be relevant or to be leaders in a future where, let's say, we're going to have more and more AI involved in our lives. What are the things that are innately human that you'd encourage your kids to be learning about today?
That's a very good question, especially because for me, I keep bringing up social media, and the reason I keep bringing that up is because it's a personal issue for me. For me, for the longest time, I mean, I'm not on any social media sites, and the reason for that is I always was suspicious of, all the negatives that could happen. We've seen, when you expose too much of yourself, people take advantage, people can steal information, all these things, right? And I was always too concerned with that. But over time, I've learned that one of the problems when you have that kind of make those kinds of decisions where you're like, I'm not just going to partake, you start participating. And I think the smarter thing to do is to learn and spend time thinking about, first of all, how are these things work in a way that, I can take advantage of the positives and not be hurt by the negatives as much as possible. And what I hope to do with my kids is to let them know that not participating in an evolving world is usually not a good idea because you just end up being left out. But they should be literate in every space where the world is changing. So they don't have to be computer scientists. They don't have to learn about AI if they don't want to. I mean, how to develop these things. But they should at least understand and keep up with the technology so they can make their own decisions. That's my hope.
I like that vision as one parent to another. That's a good advice. Well, Ken, we're out of time, but I want to make sure the audience gets a chance to hear from you, where they can learn more about the book and the work that you're doing.
Sure, thank you. So the book, you can find it on the publisher website, which is www.workingfires.org. And you can find me on LinkedIn. As I said, we've launched Squint AI. We're hoping to be on the right side of history with that, trying to make AI more responsible. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation, I think.
Ken, these are such important topics, and we're all wishing you best of luck with the book and all your endeavors. And I hope that there'll be a time when you'll come back and have another version of this conversation, because it kind of feels like we're just getting started.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've only scratched the surface, and I'd love to be back.
There you have it. That's a wrap for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.